A non-governmental organization is a not-for-profit organization that is independent from states and international governmental organizations. They are usually funded by donations, but some avoid formal funding altogether and are run primarily by volunteers. NGOs are highly diverse groups of organizations engaged in a wide range of activities, and take different forms in different parts of the world. Some may have charitable status, while others may be registered for tax exemption based on recognition of social purposes. Others may be fronts for political, religious, or other interests. The number of NGOs in the United States is estimated at 1.5 million. Russia has 277,000 NGOs. India is estimated to have had around 2 million NGOs in 2009, just over 1 NGO per 600 Indians. And many times the number of primary schools and primary health centers in India. NGOs are difficult to define, and the term NGO is not always used consistently. In some countries the term NGO is applied to an organization that in another country would be called an NPO, and vice versa. There are many different classifications of NGO in use. The most common focus is on orientation and level of operation. An NGO's orientation refers to the type of activities it takes on. These activities might include human rights, environmental, improving health, or development work. An NGO's level of operation indicates the scale at which an organization works, such as local, regional, national, or international. The term non-governmental organization was first coined in 1945, when the United Nations was created. The UN, itself an intergovernmental organization, made it possible for certain approved specialized international non-state agencies, i.e., non-governmental organizations, to be awarded observer status at its assemblies and some of its meetings. Later the term became used more widely. Today, according to the UN, any kind of private organization that is independent from government control can be termed an NGO, provided it is not for profit, non-prevention, and not simply an opposition political party. One characteristic these diverse organizations share is that the non-profit status means they are not hindered by short-term financial objectives. Accordingly, they are able to devote themselves to issues which occur across longer time horizons, such as climate change, malaria prevention, or a global ban on landmines. Public surveys reveal that NGOs often enjoy a high degree of public trust, which can make them a useful, but not always sufficient proxy for the concerns of society and stakeholders. Types. NGO types can be understood by their orientation and level of how they operate. By orientation, charitable orientation often involves a top-down paternalistic effort with little participation by the beneficiaries. It includes NGOs with activities directed toward meeting the needs of the poor peoples. Service orientation includes NGOs with activities such as the provision of health, family planning or education services in which the program is designed by the NGO and people are expected to participate in its implementation, and in receiving the service. Participatory orientation is characterized by self-help projects where local people are involved, particularly in the implementation of a project by contributing cash, tools, land, materials, labor, etc. In the classical community development project, participation begins with the need definition and continues into the planning and implementation stages. Empowering orientation aims to help poor people develop a clearer understanding of the social, political and economic factors affecting their lives, and to strengthen their awareness of their own potential power to control their lives. There is maximum involvement of the beneficiaries, with NGOs acting as facilitators. by level of operation. Community-based organizations arise out of people's own initiatives. They can be responsible for raising the consciousness of the urban poor, helping them to understand the rights in accessing needed services, and providing such services. City-wide organizations include organizations such as chambers of commerce and industry, coalitions of business, ethnic or educational groups, and associations of community organizations. National NGOs include national organizations such as the YMCAs, YWCAs, professional associations and similar groups. Some have state and city branches and assist local NGOs. International NGOs range from secular agencies such as JUSA Foundation and Save the Children organizations Oxfam, CARE, Ford Foundation, and Rockefeller Foundation to religiously motivated groups. They can be responsible for funding local NGOs, institutions and projects and implementing projects. Apart from NGO, there are alternative or overlapping terms in use, including third sector organization, non-profit organization, voluntary organization, civil society organization, grassroots organization, social movement organization, private voluntary organization, self-help organization and non-state actors. In Spanish, French, Italian and other Romance languages, the myriad abbreviation ONG is in use, which has the same meaning as NGO. Governmental-related organizations. Non-governmental organizations are a heterogeneous group. As a result, the long list of additional acronyms has developed, including BINGO, Business-Friendly International NGO or Big International NGO, SBO, Social Benefit Organization, a positive, goal-oriented designation as an substitute for the negative non-designations, TANGARD, Technical Assistance NGO, TSO, Third Sector Organization, GONGO, Government-Organized Non-Governmental Organization or Government-Operated NGOs, DONGO, Donor-Organized NGO, INGARD, International NGO, QUANGARD, Quasi-Autonomous NGO, such as the International Organization for Standardization. National NGO, a non-governmental organization that exists only in one country. This term is rare due to the globalization of non-governmental organizations, which causes an NGO to exist in more than one country. CSO, Civil Society Organization, ENGO, Environmental NGO, such as Greenpeace and WWF, NNGO, Northern NGO, Vanguard, Party NGO, set up by parties and disguised as NGOs to serve the political matters, SNGO, Southern NGO, SCO, Social Change Organization, TNGO, Transnational NGO. The term emerged during the 1970s due to the increase of environmental and economic issues in the global community. TNGO includes non-governmental organizations that are not confined to only one country, but exist in two or more countries. GSO, Grassroots Support Organization, Vanguard, Market Advocacy NGO, NGDO, Non-Governmental Development Organization. USAID refers to NGOs as private voluntary organizations. However, many scholars have argued that this definition is highly problematic, as many NGOs are in fact state or corporate-funded and managed projects and have professional staff. NGOs exist for a variety of reasons, usually to further the political or social goals of the members or founders. Examples include improving the state of the natural environment, encouraging the observance of human rights, improving the welfare of the disadvantaged, or representing a corporate agenda. However, there are a huge number of such organizations, and the goals cover a broad range of political and philosophical philosophical positions. This can also easily be applied to private schools and athletic organizations. Track 2 diplomacy. Track 2 dialogue, or Track 2 diplomacy, is transnational coordination that involves non-official members of the government, including epistemic communities as well as former policy makers, or analysts. Track 2 diplomacy aims to get policy makers and policy analysts to come to a common solution through discussions by unofficial means. Unlike the Track I diplomacy, where government officials, diplomats and elected leaders gather to talk about certain issues, Track 2 diplomacy consists of experts, scientists, professors and other figures that are not involved in government affairs. The members of Track 2 diplomacy usually have more freedom to exchange ideas and come up with compromises on their own activities. There are also numerous classifications of NGOs. The typology the World Bank uses divides them into operational and advocacy. NGOs vary in the methods. Some act primarily as lobbyists, while others primarily conduct programs and activities. For instance, an NGO such as Oxfam, concerned with poverty alleviation, might provide needy people with the equipment and skills to find food and clean drinking water, whereas an NGO like the FFDA helps through investigation and documentation of human rights violations and provides legal assistance to victims of human rights abuses. Others, such as Afghanistan Information Management Services, provide specialized technical products and services to support development activities implemented on the ground by other organizations. Operational NGOs seek to achieve small-scale change directly through projects. Quote, "They mobilize financial resources, materials, and volunteers to create localized programs. They hold large-scale fundraising events and may apply to governments and organizations for grants or contracts to raise money for projects. They often operate in a hierarchical structure, a main headquarters being staffed by professionals who plan projects, create budgets, keep accounts, and report and communicate with operational field workers who work directly on projects." Operational NGOs deal with a wide range of issues, but are most often associated with the delivery of services or environmental issues, emergency relief, and public welfare. Operational NGOs can be further categorized by the division into relief-oriented versus development-oriented organizations, according to whether they stress service delivery or participation, whether they are religious or secular, and whether they are more public or private-oriented. Although operational NGOs can be community-based, many are national or international. The defining activity of operational NGOs is the implementation of projects. Campaigning NGOs seek to achieve large-scale change promoted indirectly through influence of the political system. Campaigning NGOs need an efficient and effective group of professional members who are able to keep supporters informed and motivated. They must plan and host demonstrations and events that will keep the cause in the media. They must maintain a large informed network of supporters who can be mobilized for events to garner media attention and influence policy changes. The defining activity of campaigning NGOs is holding demonstrations. Campaigning NGOs often deal with issues relating to human rights, women's rights, children's rights. The primary purpose of an advocacy NGO is to defend or promote a specific cause. As opposed to operational project management, these organizations typically try to raise awareness, acceptance and knowledge by lobbying, press work and activist event. both operational and campaigning. It is not uncommon for NGOs to make use of both activities. Many times, operational NGOs will use campaigning techniques if they continually face the same issues in the field that could be remedied through policy changes. At the same time, campaigning NGOs, like human rights organizations, often have programs that assist the individual victims they are trying to help through their advocacy work. Public relations non-governmental organizations need healthy relationships with the public to meet the goals. Foundations and charities use sophisticated public relations campaigns to raise funds and employ standard lobbying techniques with governments. Interest groups may be of political importance because of their ability to influence social and political outcomes. A code of ethics was established in 2002 by the World Association of Non-governmental organizations. Project management. There is an increasing awareness that management techniques are crucial to project success in non-governmental organizations. Generally, non-governmental organizations that are private have either a community or environmental focus. They address varieties of issues such as religion, emergency aid, or humanitarian affairs. They mobilize public support and voluntary contributions for aid. They often have strong links with community groups in developing countries, and they often work in areas where government-to-government aid is not possible. NGOs are accepted as a part of the international relations landscape, and while they influence national and multilateral policy making, increasingly they are more directly involved in local action. Corporate structure. Staffing. Some NGOs are highly professionalized and rely mainly on paid staff. Others are based around voluntary labor and are less formalized. Not all people working for non-governmental organizations are volunteers. Many NGOs are associated with the use of international staff working in developing countries, but there are many NGOs in both North and South who rely on local employees or volunteers. There is some dispute as to whether expatriates should be sent to developing countries. Frequently this type of personnel is employed to satisfy a donor who wants to see the supported project managed by someone from an industrialized country. However, the expertise of these employees or volunteers may be counterbalanced by a number of factors. The cost of foreigners is typically higher, they have no grassroots connections in the country they are sent to, and local expertise is often undervalued. The NGO sector is an essential employer in terms of numbers. For example, by the end of 1995, Concern Worldwide, an international northern NGO working against poverty, employed 174 expatriates and just over 5,000 national staff working in 10 developing countries in Africa and Asia and in Haiti. Finding whether the NGOs are small or large. Various NGOs need budgets to operate. NGOs are little organization. The amount of budget that they need would differ from NGOs to NGOs. Unlike small NGOs, large NGOs may have annual budgets in the hundreds of millions of billions of dollars. For instance, the budget of the American Association of Retired Persons was over $540 million in 1999. Funding such large budgets demands significant fundraising efforts on the part of most NGOs. Major sources of NGO funding are membership dues, the sale of goods and services, grants from international institutions and national governments, and private donations. Several EU grants provide funds accessible to NGOs, even though the term non-governmental organization implies independence from governments. Many NGOs depend heavily on governments for the funding. A quarter of the $162 million income in 1998 of the famine relief organization Oxfam was donated by the British government and the EU. The Christian Relief and Development Organization organization World Vision United States collected $55 million worth of goods in 1998 from the American government. Government funding of NGOs is controversial since, according to David Reef, writing in the New Republic, the whole point of humanitarian intervention was precisely that NGOs and civil society had both a right and an obligation to respond with acts of aid and solidarity to people in need of being subjected to repression or want by the forces that controlled them, whatever the governments concerned might think about the matter. Quote, "Some NGOs, such as Greenpeace, do not accept funding from governments or intergovernmental organizations. Overhead costs. Overhead is the amount of money that is spent on running an NGO rather than on projects. This includes office expenses, salaries, banking and bookkeeping costs. What percentage of overall budget is spent on overhead is often used to judge an NGO, with less than 4% being viewed as good. The World Association of Non-governmental Organizations states that ideally more than 86% should be spent on programs. The Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria has specific guidelines on how high overhead can be to receive funding based on how the money is to be spent, with overhead often needing to be less than 5 to 7%. While the World Bank typically allows 37%, a high percentage of overhead to total expenditures can make it more difficult to generate funds. High overhead costs may also generate criticism, with some claiming that certain NGOs with high overhead are being run simply to benefit the people working for them. While overhead costs can be a legitimate concern, a sole focus on them can be counterproductive. Research published by the Urban Institute and the Center for Social Innovation at Stanford University have shown how rating agencies create incentives for non-profits to lower and hide overhead costs, which may actually reduce organizational effectiveness by starving organizations of the infrastructure they need to effectively deliver services. A more meaningful rating system would provide, in addition to financial data, a qualitative evaluation of an organization's transparency and governance, an assessment of program effectiveness, and an evaluation of feedback mechanisms designed for donors and beneficiaries. And such a rating system would also allow rated organizations to respond to an evaluation done by a rating agency. More generally, the popular discourse of non-profit evaluation should move away from financial notions of organizational effectiveness and toward more substantial understandings of programmatic impact, monitoring and control. In the March 2000 report on United Nations Reform Priorities, a former UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan wrote in favor of international humanitarian intervention, arguing that the international community has a right to protect citizens of the world against ethnic cleansing, genocide, and crimes against humanity. On the heels of the report the Canadian government launched the Responsibility to Protect R2P project, outlining the issue of humanitarian intervention. While the R2P doctrine has wide applications, among the more controversial has been the Canadian government's use of R2P to justify its intervention and support of the coup in Haiti. Years after R2P, the World Federalist Movement, an organization which supports the creation of democratic global structures accountable to the citizens of the world and call for the division of international authority among separate agencies, has launched Responsibility to Protect, engaging civil society, a collaboration between the WFM and the Canadian government. This project aims to bring NGOs into lockstep with the principles outlined under the original R2P project. The governments of the countries an NGO works or is registered in may require reporting or other monitoring and oversight. Funders generally require reporting and assessment. Such information is not necessarily publicly available. There may also be associations and watchdog organizations that research and publish details on the actions of NGOs working in particular geographic or program areas. In recent years, many large corporations have increased their corporate social responsibility departments in an attempt to preempt NGO campaigns against certain corporate practices. As the logic goes, if corporations work with NGOs, NGOs will not work against corporations. Greater collaboration between corporations and NGOs creates inherent risks of co-optation for the weaker partner, typically the non-profit involved. In December 2007, the United States Department of Defense Assistant Secretary of Defense S. Ward Castles established an International Health Division under Force Health Protection and AMP Readiness. Part of International Health's mission is to communicate with NGOs in areas of mutual interest. Department of Defense Directive 3000.05 in 2005 requires DoD to regard stability-enhancing activities as a mission of importance equal to combat. In compliance with international law, DoD has necessarily built a capacity to improve essential services in areas of conflict such as Iraq, where the customary lead agencies find it difficult to operate. Unlike the co-option strategy described for corporations, the OASD recognizes the neutrality of health as an essential service. International health cultivates collaborative relationships with NGOs, albeit at arm's length, recognizing the traditional independence, expertise and honest broker status. While the goals of DoD and NGOs may seem incongruent, the DoD's emphasis on stability and security to reduce and prevent conflict suggests, on careful analysis, important mutual interests. History. International non-governmental organizations have a history dating back to at least the late 18th century. It has been estimated that by 1914, there were 1083 NGOs. International NGOs were important in the anti-slavery movement and the movement for women's suffrage, and reached a peak at the time of the World Disarmament Conference. However, the phrase non-governmental organization only came into popular use with the establishment of the United Nations Organization in 1945 with provisions in Article 71 of Chapter 10 of the United Nations Charter for a consultative role for organizations which are neither governments nor member states. See consultative status. The definition of international NGO is first given in Resolution 288 of ECOSOC on February 27, 1950. It is defined as any international organization that is not founded by an international treaty. The vital role of NGOs and other major groups in sustainable development was recognized in Chapter 27 of Agenda 21, leading to intenser arrangements for a consultative relationship between the United Nations and non-governmental organizations. It has been observed that the number of INGO founded or dissolved matches the general state of the world, rising in periods of growth and declining in periods of crisis. Rapid development of the non-governmental sector occurred in Western countries as a result of the processes of restructuring of the welfare state. Further globalization of that process occurred after the fall of the communist system and was an important part of the Washington Consensus. Globalization during the 20th century gave rise to the importance of NGOs. Many problems could not be solved within a nation. International treaties and international organizations such as the World Trade Organization were centered mainly on the interests of capitalist enterprises. In an attempt to counterbalance this trend, NGOs have developed to emphasize humanitarian issues, developmental aid and sustainable development. A prominent example of this is the World Social Forum, which is a rival convention to the World Economic Forum held annually in January in Davos. Switzerland. The Fifth World Social Forum in Porto Alegre, Brazil, in January 2005 was attended by representatives from more than 1,000 NGOs. In terms of environmental issues and sustainable development, the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992 was the first to show the power of international NGOs, when about 2,400 representatives of NGOs came to play a central role in deliberations. Some have argued that in forums like these, NGOs take the place of what should belong to popular movements of the poor. Whatever the case, NGO transnational networking is now extensive. Another issue which has brought NGOs to develop further is the inefficiency of some top-heavy, global structures. For instance, in 1994, a former UN envoy to Somalia, Mohammed Sanan, published a book entitled Somalia: The Missed Opportunities, in which he clearly shows that when the United Nations tried to provide humanitarian assistance, they were totally outperformed by NGOs, whose competence and dedication sharply contrasted with the United Nations' excessive caution and bureaucratic inefficiencies. The main Somalia envoys operating from the safety of their desks in Nairobi. The refusal of Boutros Ghali, then UN Secretary-General, to accept this criticism led to the early end of Mohammed Sanan's mission in Somalia.